Well, good morning. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this important discussion today that we're hosting with Dr. Kathryn Stoner, who's joining us from Stanford University, Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Very pleased to have her to talk about her book, Russia Resurrected: Its Power and Purpose in a New Global Order. We understand the book is just now available. And the topic is very interesting for us for a number of reasons. We have at the center been focusing on great power competition between the United States and Russia and China for the past year. And a very important element of that conversation, of course, is understanding both the capabilities and the intent of our adversaries. And it is very important in order for us to make good recommendations about our relationship with those two countries, for us to have a good grounding of understanding in what's happening there. This is part of a series of discussions with authors we've had on both Russia and China issues. And we're really proud to have Dr. Stoner to help enhance our understanding of what's really happening in Russia today and help us understand the context of what we need to know for policy making for a new administration. The timing is, of course, interesting, having just finished a presidential transition period and inaugurated a new president yesterday. We are understandably, as a country, looking forward and trying to understand what kind of policy changes we'll see from the United States perspective. We have also just experienced an historic cyber hack attributed to Russia recently, which of course will have a profound impact on how that policy, the new policy between the United States and Russia, will actually be implemented. In addition, we've got some major issues on the table, including New START, nuclear arms control discussions. There's a very tight window now for President Biden to extend New START and consider what to do next in terms of arms control. I'll use this as an opportunity to plug a conversation we're hosting next Monday, January 25th, which will be moderated by our own board chairman, Ambassador Tom Pickering, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, where we'll look specifically at the arms control issue. So that'll be a very interesting conversation for next week. But for now, on this first full day of the Joe Biden presidential administration, as we look forward and consider how to ground our understanding of our relationship with Russia and what we need to do in terms of crafting American foreign policy, let's look specifically at what's happening in Russia and get Dr. Stoner's take on this. I do want to reference our very own Joshua Huminski's very excellent write-up on the book. We'll post a link in the chat box today to that. I noted that in Joshua's review, he mentioned that there are some perhaps incorrect assumptions that many Americans and Western policymakers and scholars have been using, assuming Russia playing a weak hand well, or perhaps playing a stronger hand than we need to assume. That's one of the questions I hope we can unpack a little bit today. I will note that Joshua described the book as helping challenge assumptions, question commonly held perspectives, and undermining some popular misconceptions. So there's a lot to gain from this conversation. With that, Dr. Stoner, let me turn it over to you and tell us about the book, your process, and what are the key takeaways for us to understand in terms of what's happening in Russia, so we can make good recommendations when it comes to U.S.-Russia policy. And thank you again for being with us.
Sure. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for having me. And I know Joshua's out there. Thank you for the review. My husband actually said to me, "Are you sure your mother didn't write that?" So, so it was a very glowing and kind review. But yeah, it is, the book is, I have some slides. So rather than staring at beautiful Stanford landscape in the background, maybe I'll have you, which is actually not the day we're having out here at the moment. It's still 7:30 a.m. I will just show you, I think, some of the slides just to give you a sense of what the book argument is, and so you can sort of focus on that. But since you asked what is process, here's my sharing. Can you see? Are you getting anything now?
Not yet.
Okay, let me. Oh yeah, I always forget this last button
Okay,
where you
looks like
actually
it's coming
do
through. Yes, it's up now.
There we go. Okay, so in the acknowledgments section, actually, the hard copy of the book I just received, and it'll be out February 1st on Amazon and through Oxford. The Kindle version is out now if you're a Kindler, but it actually it came up, as I mentioned in the acknowledgments. Started on a bus in a conversation I had with a young foreign policy analyst in Moscow, whose name I won't mention, but he, just chatting with him as a new generation of people who watch, in particular, U.S.-Russia relations. I asked him what the goal was of Russian foreign policy, and this was about 6 years ago. And he said, "Oh, that's easy." And he turned to me and said very seriously, "To beat you." And since you may have just heard the out in my voice, you'll note that I was actually born in Canada and moved to the United States when I was 20. And I thought at first, well, that will be easy because Canada is not known for its military prowess. And then, of course, I realized he's, of course, talking about the United States. And it seemed a particularly bold statement, given that again and again, we hear that Russia is weak, Russia is in decline. It is a waning power. It is not a country on the rise. And so I came back with that statement in my mind. And at that time, we had a number of talks at Stanford held by various policymakers and analysts talking about, again, Russia's relative strength and power. And it occurred to me that there's a bit of an outdated perspective on Russia and the perception of Russia stuck in the 1990s as a country whose economy was a shambles, that is completely dependent on oil export revenues and really has little else than that, is fixed in people's minds. And as I began to do the research on this book, I came to realize that this is very, I think, as I said, outdated. And so the book tries to update some of that by really assessing Russia's relative strength, relative power. And so the book is about 320 pages, but my mother says it reads like it's 300 pages. And it's written for a more general audience. So if you know a lot about Russia, you'll still get, I think, a lot out of it. But it begins with quotations. Each chapter begins with a quotation from Vladimir Putin. And this is one he's taking from Talleyrand or Churchill. It's been variously attributed to these folks that he makes in May of 2002. So remember, he comes into power in August of 1999 under Boris Yeltsin as a prime minister. And then Yeltsin walks off the stage of politics in Russia on December 31st, 1999, saying very dramatically, I tried, but turns out things were harder than I thought they would be. And here's my designated successor, Vladimir Putin, do your best. So 2000, January 1st, 2000, Russians wake up and they have this new acting president who's never held elected public office before. We all know he comes from St. Petersburg, where he had been a deputy mayor, and before that, a lieutenant colonel in the KGB serving in East Germany. Here he is, May 2002, saying Russia was never so strong as it wants to be and never so weak as it is thought to be. And he attributes this to Churchill, as I mentioned. But I think this quote does give you a sense of the fact that Russia, sometimes its ambitions have outstripped historically its means, but its means are more usually than we may think they are. And so the motivating questions of the book is Russia resurrected as a strong state? And I should say the book is called Russia Resurrected. When I originally pitched it to the press, there was a question mark after resurrected. They took that away after reading it, and so it's just Russia Resurrected, its power and purpose in a new global order. So the motivating questions are these: is Russia resurrected as a strong state? What is a strong state? How do we assess power in international relations? And are we using the right metrics when we declare Russia not as strong, certainly, as the United States? Is Russia a great power? And you had mentioned you're doing work on great power politics, in particular, comparing China, the United States, and now Russia. So again, there is this schizophrenia in perception, right? You're including it in a great power study. And then there are others who are saying it's a power in decline. So what are the dimensions of power, and specifically, how does Russia measure up? And then the second part of the book is really, what is the purpose of Russian use of its power capabilities? And what does all of this mean for the determinants of power in the 21st century and Russia's relative position to the United States and China? Here is General Breedlove coming out to Stanford in 2015, making this bold statement. And what's surprising is he's saying this 30 years, at that time, 25 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We're coming up on 30 years now. And when we think about the collapse of the Soviet Union and exactly how far it fell, and what Boris Yeltsin, when he became Russia's president in 1991, what he had to work with, it's often called the greatest man-made depression, economic depression outside of wartime. The Soviet Union, of course, when it ended, was a country that had tremendous loans. It had a decrepit, broken military. There was concern about famine across the 15 republics, and Russia emerges out of the rubble of the Soviet Union as a country in great need. And not as a superpower, although it does still have its nuclear weapons, which we helped it service and contain in the immediate collapse of the Soviet Union. I remember as a graduate student in the early 1990s in Russia, actually being able to buy USAID chickens on the street of Moscow because they, I guess, had been offloaded from trucks and sold on the black market. So Russia was even receiving food aid. And yet, 25 years after that, now 30, here is the Supreme Commander of NATO saying Russia is rewriting the Cold War settlement using force. And of course, in our own national security doctrine, it is designated as one of the major threats to the United States. Not what we had thought would happen in 1991 when we'd hoped that Russia was transitioning to some sort of open form of government, if not a full-fledged democracy under Yeltsin. And certainly didn't look as though it could reemerge as a major threat in this way, such that Breedlove, who the Russians call breed hate, would declare capable of rewriting this Cold War settlement, which we view as having won, of course, and the Russians view as us dancing in the end zone as a result. So, as you mentioned also, Representative Nye, that there's frequently this perspective that Russia punches above its weight, right? So you have to think about what is the weight class and what are the determinants of how we think about relative state power in international relations. And so one argument in the book here is that we're thinking of power too narrowly, and so we're constantly surprised and overlook other capabilities. So let's think about what Russia has done to reemerge, to have Phil Breedlove say something like that in 2015. Well, so we were initially surprised by the quick seizure of Crimea and the disruption and continuing low-boil war on the eastern border of Ukraine. Then quickly mobilizing to Syria and showing off new weapons from a complete overhaul of the Russian military, largely transitioning to a professional military force from a conscript force that had been very easily defeated in the two Chechen wars in 1994 and 1996, recoups somewhat, but bombs the heck out of Grozny from the air, and just has a scorched earth policy there. Um, in Georgia in 2008, the Russian military does not comport particularly well, given the incredibly tiny size of the Georgian military. Though it still is able to win the Georgian war. But we wouldn't have thought of the Russian military as being, particularly well trained. Again, largely conscript army, was very heavy on the officer side of things, poorly equipped because they, just couldn't afford good equipment and not well disciplined. What we see though in Crimea and then in Syria is a completely different show with a completely different set of weapons. And Syria becomes a big opportunity also to sell those weapons into the Middle East and into Southern Africa. The Syrian incursion really changes the facts on the ground in the Middle East, and Russia is really there to stay for a long time. We've also been surprised by Russia's willingness to use its cyber capabilities, most notably in 2016 with our elections. And their interference there, and used to change the information environment, but also more recently, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks, and I had a piece on this in the Wall Street Journal, in terms of infiltrating several of our very large departments within the United States government, and we still don't know the full extent of the damage that's been done there. These are not things necessarily that are all measured by the strength of the Russian economy. And so what we frequently hear is that, oh, they can't maintain this. Syria will be a quagmire. Well, actually, they've been able to be very efficient with what they've had. And of course, we've helped them somewhat by withdrawing internationally. But under President Putin, they've really rushed in to the vacuum that was created. And so I think when we think of Russia as a declining power, as people typically do, but again, there's this schizophrenic perception, right? On the one hand, classified as a great power in our national security doctrines and documents as an existential threat to the United States. But on the other hand, somehow decrepit and in decline. And as Mitt Romney and John McCain have variously described it, a gas station masquerading as a country. When we think of traditional measures of power, it's usually the size of the population, the size of the military, that is maybe the number of soldiers, the kinds of weapons, and then the strength of its economy and size of its economy. But my book argues that power is a little more multidimensional than that. It's relative to other states and other times, of course, and it's contextual. So I use the metaphor of a card game, right? So a good hand of cards in the game of bridge is a bad hand of cards in poker. And so it really depends on what game you're playing before you declare your strength relative to another player. And I think this is something we've overlooked. And therefore, as long as we continue to do it, we'll be constantly surprised by what Russian capabilities are and their willingness to use what they have. So the third point really is that a country's tools of power capabilities can be good enough. They don't have to be the best or better than the United States in every category to be very disruptive. And this all depends on context and the will to use them. So the second big point is that the characterization of Russia as weak is, I think, outdated because we are misspecifying power. Russia has recovered and maintained some of its prior capacities a little more than we appreciate. So it maintained nuclear parity with us, and it has modernized some of its nuclear weapons. And Putin is very proud of some of the fantastical weaponry, like the Poseidon missile, for example, that may or may not exist, but certainly could act as a deterrent against us. It has some new tools of international power, in particular cyber, or what we call sharp power, that are expensive. That are not very expensive relative to, let's say, an intercontinental ballistic missile, but are very disruptive, as we have witnessed ourselves. Russia's lack of institutional checks enable Putin as a powerful, long-serving president to use Russian tools of power and international influence quickly and without much accountability. And his tolerance for risk is very high. And I would say this is something that's quite different from the Soviet Union, where at least you had a Politburo where there was some check against the general secretary, who was definitely first among equals. But as we know, two general secretaries were tossed out. One was Khrushchev, and the other was Gorbachev, cooed against by his own Politburo. So, oops, I'll try and advance this. Those are the two correctives, I think, that the book provides. I argue against this this common perspective that Russia under Putin is behaving just as any great power would do. The game, by this account, is power maximization for its own sake. And those of you who might remember your classes from international relations or introductory international relations, this would be a realist perspective, right? So states are out there to maximize power. And so everything they do is not based on ideology or belief, it's based on getting more of everything. This perspective also often implies that geography, that is the relative size of the country, its resource endowments, the size of its population, again, determine foreign policy interests and winners and losers in the game of international policy. And if this perspective is true, these things shouldn't change over time and across regime types, because they're all structurally determined, the goals of foreign policy of any state. And again, if this perspective is true, Russia is doomed, therefore, to be against the West, regardless of the type of regime. Even if we had a democracy there, it doesn't matter. So the logic here would tell us that given that we have more of everything, Russia shouldn't be much of a threat. And yet it is, as I just recounted for you, as recent experience demonstrates, and of course, as we are claiming in our own national security documents. So again, I use this multidimensional approach to power in international politics: power over what or whom, and power to do what. And I note that a power asset in one situation may be a liability in another. So yeah, we have a lot of very powerful nuclear weapons. Russia does too, but you can't use nuclear weapons very often, right? So great to have, maybe, but they're not exactly usable in all situations. Yes, we have a more capable and larger military. We spend more than Russia on the military, and the book documents this as well. But we tend not to consider the fact that we should measure the amount Russia spends as in terms of purchasing power parity. So they don't buy their weaponry from abroad. Of course, they make it at home. They're not buying it from someone else. They're buying it in rubles and selling it to places like China and India. They're the number one and two suppliers, or number one supplier, pardon me, in both places. As well as through the Middle East. We sell more weapons abroad than Russia, but they're number two in that perspective in terms of international arms dealing. So you can't use big things like nuclear weapons necessarily in all situations. And we also tend to assume that what we'll have when we think about relative power, that what we will have with Russia is some kind of big kinetic war. And that's not necessarily going to be the case, right? So the fact that we have more soldiers doesn't necessarily matter in every instance. The book uses some arguments by a guy named Baldwin at Princeton that again, you have to think about what the game is we're playing and look at the cards that way. I argue instead something relatively simple. I think Russia has enough and occasionally more in terms of power assets than we have, but more isn't always what matters. And the real issue is that domestic politics in Russia is such that Putin has the will to use what Russia has, what it has maintained from the Soviet period, and what it has rebuilt. And he is now unconstrained. So the second part of the book is making this argument about domestic politics, and really that there is something about Putinism, that the deployment of Russian power resources abroad is really determined by the regime type at home. So domestic politics drive Russian foreign policy as much or more than those structural interests that a realist argument, where might makes right, might suggest. And this is why we have been surprised, I think, is because we haven't looked at this. There's something, in other words, about Putinism, and the book also talks about the counterfactual. Imagine post Cold War Russia as post Cold War Germany, and how different the world might look, how such a Russia might behave if it looked more like that. And I also make the argument that there was no inevitability to someone like Putin coming out of the end of the 1990s in Russia. So I'm covering a 316-page book in 20 minutes, and I'm leaving out most of the data, but I'm hoping that most of the data will come out. As we move forward, I should mention, and as Joshua knows, because he very bravely made his way through all of those tables and charts, that there's a lot about the outline of the book is such that we look first at this argument of power and how we measure it. I go through where Russia is in terms of its other regional actors, and then where Russia is globally in terms of spreading itself and establishing itself more as a global power, and noting that it has established strong relationships across the Middle East, even with, for example, Saudi Arabia and Iran, who are traditionally at one another's throats. It is, of course, into Syria, has moved through Libya, has maintained a warlord in a position of great power in Libya, and has forgiven debts through sub-Saharan Africa. Has started to sell nuclear power plants through Africa, marketing the oil and diamonds and other resources of sub-Saharan African countries, and of course taking a cut, and controlling something that is not measured, of course, by GDP or the size of your military or the health and wealth of your population. Oil and gas infrastructure, so pipelines and other transportation networks. This is something they've gained in particular in their efforts in Syria, even making arrangements and alliances for marketing oil and gas with our allies, including Iraq, where we shed a lot of sweat and blood. I also look into Latin America. Maduro is in power still, partly in large part, frankly, because of Russian intervention. Russia helping to market Venezuelan oil, and now even owning a good part of Venezuelan National Oil Company. So that gives you hopefully a taste. Then I look into the geographic scope and then the policy domain. Russia is a particularly weighty actor in some really important places or policy areas, and energy is one of them, of course. But in also, it is the #1 wheat exporter in the world now, and it is pretty strong in pharmaceuticals. It has become less dependent on oil exports, although it's still heavily dependent on oil exports for generating its GDP. But this has gone down over time, and there now is a decoupling. I'm not sure if I can get to this slide quickly, and then I promise I'll stop talking. There is a decoupling of GDP and oil. Let's see if I can get here. This is just GDP per capita, and you can see it's not actually quite as poor a country. This is comparing Russia from 1990 to 2017 with Brazil, India, China, South Africa, European Union 28, and the US. Here's the United States in terms of GDP per capita purchasing power parity. So if you bought the same basket of goods in one place as in another, US obviously doing the best. Here's the European Union 28 with Brexit. This is before Brexit, of course. And here's Russia in this group. So, not doing, it's actually doing better than China in per capita terms at purchasing power parity. So we think of Russia sometimes as a poor country, but actually it's a much wealthier country than China, for example. Here we see a decrease in exports. Of course, oil prices are starting to go down here, and there's oil demand globally starting to go down. Obviously, Russia here in the red, hugely dependent still on revenue from oil and petroleum and gas exports as a percentage of its total exports. But what I wanted to note was, look at this is starting to flatten out. Yes, demand is going down. And this, of course, is a global product. However, look at the same time, yeah, oil prices are going down here, but Russia's GDP continues to go up. So that is some evidence that that Russia's GDP is not anymore after about 2014 so heavily dependent as it was before, where things used to travel pretty closely, GDP and the price of oil. And that's because there has been some diversification. I don't want to overstate that, but there has been some diversification, right? What we see as over dependence on oil and gas and other commodities. Obviously, Russian economists see too, and the Russian government sees too. They're not, stupid. And so there have been some programs, and the book documents this to diversify. But Russia still has a lot of problems. And this is, again, just changes in export structure. Still has a lot of problems with its economy and investment in research and development. And the book goes through this as well. I also go through the hard power means. So comparing directly our military, the Chinese military and the Russian military in terms of spending, in terms of number of troops, in terms of where they are, in terms of the kinds of capabilities that we have. And obviously the US is best, but Russia is, supplies a lot to China. This also means that, comes with a chain of maintenance contracts, the same as with India. Russia and China together can outspend and outperform NATO. So the fact that they are becoming closer and closer in terms of their cooperation, even if we consider Russia a junior partner, is worrisome. And that is a problem for the incoming administration. And then, of course, in the end, I look at soft and sharp power. So soft power is this kind of illiberal values and conservative values pull that appeals to countries in the Middle East and some in Southeast Asia and Latin America that Putin has pushed. Russia is a bulwark against European and American hedonism and permissiveness. And then I look at sharp power, that is attempts to change the information environment. Russia Today, which we know about, and Sputnik, which broadcasts even into St. Louis with its own perspective, the Russian perspective. And Americans don't even know it necessarily. And then finally, of course, the Facebook pages, the bots, the tweets from bots, all trying to shape an information environment in 2016, and the hacks, where Russia is very, very good, and we are too. But Russia is very good at burrowing in, evidently, to our networks. I'll just finish by saying that the book then goes into, okay, it's a little stronger than we might have thought, a little more capable than what we might have thought. It's more resurrected than you might have thought because you're looking in the wrong places. Why? And again, I go back to this argument about actors and regime type versus structure. And so there is, I think, something about Putinism and something about autocracy. And the need to maintain some degree of support at home and convince Russians that their country is under siege and Russia is a great power merely defending itself and must do this. At the same time, a lot of its activities bring in money, right? And we have had Russia with the Europeans under sanctions since 2014. Well, moving into the Middle East, moving into sub-Saharan Africa, getting closer with China have helped Russia's GDP compensate for that. So in the end, Russia is more resurrected and more capable, I think, than we commonly accept because we've looked at the wrong measures and the wrong kinds of capabilities. It is a disruptive power. It is a global power. It's not a regional power anymore. And I do think it's specific to Putin, and this is not inevitable. So I'll stop there. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Dr. Stoner, for a fascinating walk through what we need to understand about Russia's relative power on the world stage and some of the reasons, some of the compelling reasons why it has the capabilities it has, how it determines its strategy. I want to remind our participants that we're going to open now to questions. I see there's already a few questions in the Q&A box. And in just a moment, I'm going to ask Dan Mahaffey to come back on and field some of those questions to you. If folks want to type questions in the Q&A box, that's the easiest way, and Dan will pull them. I wanted to start with one question that is on my mind for you, and I'm going to paste in the chat box now that you referenced a Wall Street Journal piece from the end of last year where you responded to the cyber attacks, and in that piece you talked about a number of important elements. One was the cyber attack itself, what it tells us, but you also talked about some connections to Russian capabilities, economic strength, willingness to manipulate the map in Europe. So I want to just pick up on one of those questions for you now, and that is the question of the cyber attack, because we opened today talking about the context of a new president. Obviously, that's an important context for our discussion. I have argued in some writing last year that Russia is perhaps due a strong repercussion for cyber meddling. Of course, that notion complicates the idea of discussions around arms control. All these things are overlapping at the same time. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in your thoughts on the cyber piece. A massive level cyber attack by the Russian government on American, both government and private sector infrastructure tells us something about their capabilities. Whether or not it's a great powers question, it is a significant capability to have that kind of cyber strength. It also tells us something about their willingness to take risk. And yes, there are some attribution challenges in cyber, which makes it harder than other areas of hard power sometimes. Mm-hmm. But it's not a place where one can perfectly hide. It also tells us something of their assessment of us and our leadership and a willingness to respond. So I'm wondering if you might just talk us through a little bit what we need to understand from that. What are the most important lessons for us?
So I think one of the surprising things is that they're willing to do this, and so what is the purpose? When will the other shoe drop? Right, because my understanding, and there may well be more, people in the audience who have better information than this, but my understanding is they're still grabbing things from what they have implanted in the software that has been discovered, in the code that's been discovered. What will they do with that information? Well, they could do a lot with it, but we don't exactly know what they have, right? Or at least that hasn't been made public. But they seem most interested in I think they're probably perfectly capable of never being caught. Yet they've left footprints, and so maybe wanted to be caught. So I think what we need to know is that that as Putin perhaps becomes less secure domestically, they become more aggressive internationally. And so I can see a question in the chat that's just coming up about his popularity, which is still high, but has declined, especially in the last 2 or 3 years. And so what does that mean exactly for an autocracy, right? I have a friend in Russia who says the only thing surprising about elections is that they happen, not the outcome. That's true, but he likes to look legitimate. So he went through the trouble of having, during a pandemic, hundreds of things inserted into the Russian constitution, that the most notorious of which, of course, lets him stay in power potentially for another 12 years, till 2036. Why did he do that? That isn't the sign necessarily of a guy who feels secure. It's a guy who feels like he needs some kind of law to maintain himself in power. Short of using more violence, he needs to maintain some kind of legitimacy, right? And one way of doing that is by demonstrating that to his own people at home, Russia's a global power. Look what we can do. Look how the United States now worries about us. We're back. And so there are a lot of quotes throughout my book on, Putin making these declarations, no one will mess with us. They tried to keep us down and they can't. And we're resurrected as a country that to be reckoned with. So much of this is for the domestic audience. So the implication there is that if you had a different regime and a different leader, and we saw this under Medvedev, even though Putin, for those 4 years from 2008 to 2012, was prime minister, and when Medvedev was president, and then they swapped back positions after 2012. We saw that they were perfectly capable of signing things like New START. They're perfectly capable of cooperating with us over Libya, right? Remember, they abstained, and Putin was quite upset about that. So it's not, there's something specific about Putin and needing to keep this cronyistic system in place, and so any threats to it will provoke this, I think, strong international response, and any domestic threats to it, as we just saw earlier this week, like Alexei Navalny, a guy who has no organized political party. Right, he's not sitting in any governmental position as an official opposition. Yet look how they worry so much about this guy. We know his name more in the United States than they know it in Russia. They try to kill him. They sort of hapless and mess it up. He is able to trick one of the protagonists of his own assassination into confessing on the telephone. And as he's sitting in jail, having come back from Germany, where he's recovering from his poisoning, they arrest him, of course, right away. What for? Violating his probation while he's convalescing in Germany from an assassination attempt. He's sitting in jail and is allowed, somehow his organization releases this amazing video about Putin's palace. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. It's good stuff. Where he spends $1 billion. So, this is just, I think, Putin is obsessed with any kind of threat to the regime and to the stability of the regime. And he's even said this, he said it about 2 months ago, Russia's had enough revolutions. We can have evolutionary development, but not revolutionary development. And so the real fear is the street. And so the book makes this argument as well in ways in which they have tried to curtail this. But the paranoia has gotten worse over time. And I think, and I also show his popularity going up and down from 1999 in the book. And you can tell by my hand actions. And you can map a lot of events to when his popularity is down. They grab Crimea, goes way back up again. And it bounces along and comes down again with the pandemic. But there's no alternative, and he likes to keep it that way.
Thank you. Let me ask Dan Mahaffey in the 15 minutes we've got left to get through some of these great questions with you. Dan?
Thanks, Glenn, and thanks, Dr. Stoner. One of these questions here, and within the context of, as you described, our work on great power competition and understanding the Russia-China dynamic, how would you advise U.S. policymakers to balance concerns about Russia, the ongoing Asia-Pacific pivot, Indo-Pacific? There's a bipartisan consensus behind that, but do we risk taking our eye off of Russia too much in favor of China?
I think so. I think that has been an issue. Russia is the dominant power in Europe. It just is, right? Militarily, it's not as economically weak as we might think, and it has tremendous amount of leverage over the most economically powerful country in Europe, which is Germany, with its, in particular, gas transportation networks and gas supplies into various parts of Europe, as well as oil. into other parts of Europe. So that's very problematic. Nord Stream 1, of course, exists. So even in the extraordinarily unlikely event that Nord Stream 2, another natural gas pipeline, was not completed, and it will be. It's 96% completed, and we've sanctioned it. And we're going very aggressively after the companies that cooperate. Well, we're fighting with Germany over this, right? Germany needs it. They want it done, and it will be done, alas, in I think just a few more months. This is perfect for Russia. That's exactly what they want. They want to deal. They want to separate us from our European allies. Check. And they will do it this way with gas supplies. They will do it by funding populist parties or Brexit. Check, did that, gave Marine Le Pen money. Also supplying Turkey with anti-ballistic missile systems, member of NATO. Check. So try and separate that out. Have done the same with Greece, trolling through Southern Europe by offering money. This is behaving in a different way than the Soviets did, right? This is using different kinds of power resources. This is being really rather bold about that. And I think we can now say unequivocally, this is the most powerful, as in influential, as in getting people to do things they might not otherwise do, country in Europe. And we took our eye off the ball on that partly by pivoting to Asia. I mean, we shouldn't ignore China by any stretch of the imagination, but Russia has recovered, and we clung, I think, to an outdated narrative of where it is. And don't forget what it is willing to do under Putinism. And so I do think we can reverse this, but we have to deal with Putin for quite a long time. If he chooses to stay in power until 2036. There is, of course, a rumor that he's got Parkinson's or something else, and so will eventually step down. But it's just a rumor at this point.
How does the Russian leadership view the long-term relationship with China? The Sino-Soviet split was key to U.S. Cold War policy, but now we have our Eurasian adversaries, potential ones, coming closer together. How does how does Moscow see the rise of China in their own neighborhood and partnerships?
They see it as an opportunity, and they've seized it to the extent that they can. I think we made much of Russia and China being in conflict, especially over Central Asia, because of Belt and Road in Russia's traditional neighborhood. It hasn't turned out that way. They behave differently, I think, in the international system, and so. Russia has cooperated to the extent that it can. We usually think, I think also, or the common narrative is that Russia is a junior partner to China. China has so much money, and Russia depends on China buying its oil and gas. Well, okay, that's a cup half empty. Those things are true, but it's also true that Russia is the biggest supplier to China of oil. China needs that oil to continue growing. Russia is also the biggest supplier of weaponry to China. China needs that, but Russia also controls the maintenance of China's weaponry. Therefore, China and Russia are working together on opportunities of a new northern northern trade route, through the Arctic as the climate changes. And so before the pandemic, there was actually an uptick in Chinese investment in Russia. And so, foreign direct investment hasn't gone down in Russia as much as we might have thought, given that we and the Europeans have maintained these sanctions. Well, who stepped in? Saudi Arabia and UAE, and also China. And so, this is problematic for us. She, and by the way, there's some interesting quotes where she and Putin refer to one another as their very best friends, and they've each, they've exchanged the equivalent of the Presidential Medals of Freedom. So this
not
is
quite a necklace where they each have one half of the.
but they almost
Almost. Yeah.
They're besties.
Yeah. With the to speak a little bit more about Putin too, and we've got a couple questions here about certainly, what can we understand about his wealth, the wealth of those in his inner circle, and do some of, and interestingly too, some of the the measures that have been done in terms of transparency, financial transparency in the West, how does that affect their wealth, their ability to operate, and or do they just level that as part of the cost of doing business nowadays?
You mean
Getting around the transparency, getting around sanctions, how are those measures affecting the wealth of the inner circle, and are those measures that we're starting to put in having an impact?
Well, they don't like it, right? Obviously, it's at the very least inconvenient, because they can't access their money, and they have to pay private school fees for their kids in London or wherever. It's that is problematic, and so this is why I think we saw in 2016 this odd encounter with members of the Trump inner circle in Trump Tower, coming in to talk about adoption. Well, it was really about sanctions and sanction relief. So this could also be why Putin is trying to, and the book has an argument about patronal kleptocracy, Putin's system. And this could also be, a need to, the changes to the Constitution, for example, that will let him stay in power if he chooses till 2036, could be to signal members of his inner circle that I'm still valuable. Don't, I'm going to keep the goods flowing. You can't get rid of me. The whole system is kind of a pyramid of patronage that flows down, and so the big patron still has to be able to deliver. So there are, domestic constraints in that sense. They're just not institutionally formal. In terms of being able to sell oil abroad, this has not been problematic, because they have still been able to, it requires a lot of capital moving around quickly, and they've been able to do that. That is an area of vulnerability. However, that would hurt us too in the global financial system. So that's not something that we can really use against them. But yeah, the book describes in a way that I can't, and then trying to keep my answers short, which I'm not doing, and I'm not doing a very good job at that. But in kind of explaining how that system of patronage works, and noting that there's some vulnerabilities to the person at the top as a result of that.
How do some of the Navalny's revelations about the mansion palace being built, those videos, those getting the sense of the wealth, does that message resonate more with the Russian people, or people who are mid-level in the apparatus figuring out whether how long this patronage scheme can continue?
Well, both, right? Because those are people after all. But one of the interesting things I think, and I note this as well in a chapter I have on Russian society, is that there's an entire generation that has grown up now with only Putin as president. Those people tend not to watch national television, which is pretty strictly scripted. And instead, they're getting their news from YouTube. And that is, and other places like that. Of course, there are other social media platforms. But that is where Navalny is extremely effective. Right? Those are the folks looking at this. So who was out on the street in the spring of 2017? It was the children of people who were protesting in the early 1990s. It was kids who had been, who were arrested. What were they responding to? Another video that Navalny had done, this one exposing corruption on Medvedev. I think that was pretty effective, honestly. And we're now seeing from Levada, which is the sort of most reputable polling and surveying outfit in Russia, indicating in November of 2019, 53% of Russians between ages 18 and 24 in their sample indicating that they intended to emigrate, permanently leave. That's tremendously problematic for Putin's long-term development schemes. There's no point in investing more in R&D if the very people that you're trying to train are intending to leave the country with that knowledge. So, this is where Navalny is really hitting him, and this is why I think they moved so swiftly and are well, first they tried to kill him. Now they're going to put him in jail first for 30 days, and I'm guessing 3 to 10 years probation beyond that to try and restrain this in particular and any sort of generational change.
As we start to wind down, I'd ask the question, looking forward, what are the areas of cooperation that we can find with Russia? And how might those avenues of cooperation be informed by some of the mistakes we've made over the past decade?
Yeah, so one of the reasons I started this book was because I have a number of friends and colleagues who've served in U.S. government, and also just being exposed to folks who've served in the National Security Council last 8 or so years. There has often been, I'm often struck by the point where they say, the Russians want to be treated as our equals, and they're just not. And I think this is the wrong conversation to have, right? Is that we get nothing from saying, but you're not our equals, and we won the Cold War. We want to pursue interests, right? And get what is best for the United States. So what's best for the United States would be, quite frankly, to get rid of Vladimir Putin's regime and have a more open or accountable form of government. It's not impossible that it could even happen under Putin himself, although it's extremely unlikely given what he's just done. After all, the first few years of Putinism were not what Putinism is now, right? This is a system that has evolved over time. We saw opportunities under Medvedev for a different form of government, and we certainly saw them under Yeltsin. I think we have to do what we have not done the last 4 years, which is begin to press more on society, right? And on this paranoia that Putin has of the street and people rising up or getting too much knowledge about how the system has begun to work, or too much evidence of it in the form of people like Navalny. I mean, it's otherwise just absolutely confounding why he would care about Alexei Navalny, except that he does these little exposés, and there must be some element of truth, even for the biggest doubters, if the regime cares so much. Otherwise, not simply dismiss it. So I think that's one thing. Where can we work together? Well, I think we have to try to get some of the things that we've lost back. The most pressing is New START. We haven't lost it yet, but this is an obvious low-hanging fruit. But other things are trying to open up immigration for young Russians in particular who want to either leave and bring their knowledge here. Let's think of some of the companies that have been started by Russian emigres, the Googles of the world, for example. There's that, and making it easier for them to come to school here. I think also, as most are saying, and I think it's a particularly appropriate thing to say after the inauguration, we have to get our own house in order. We're just not an example, and this is giving an old autocrat like Putin new life by showing, look at the disorder in the United States because of democracy and allowing these people to protest. And disinformation, that's a terrific opening. All they did was exploit things that are already there and did it, and it turned out not to be too difficult. That I think will also make a tremendous difference to demonstrate that our democracy is resilient, that institutions work, that there is justice and fairness and equality in our system in a way that there is not there. We see the seeds of disillusionment in Russians. We saw, before the pandemic began, a lot of protests. There's been one going on every Sunday in Khabarovsk, in the Russian Far East, against the Kremlin's removal of an elected governor. So there are seeds of change in Russian society, and that's what will bring about change in their political system in the long run. And so we have to encourage those, I think, and create programs to encourage those.
Well, thanks, Dr. Stoner. Thanks for answering our questions, and thank you for your time. I'll turn it back to Glenn.
I appreciate, Dr. Stoner, your comment about leading by the power of our example in terms of what we can do as the United States to project an image of the supremacy of the democratic project and system. That's on us now to do, but I appreciate you helping us understand what we need to know about Russia in terms of crafting the policy of a new administration going forward. Thank you for taking the effort to write Russia Resurrected, its power and purpose in a new global order. It sounds like it's going to be a very important piece of work in terms of challenging assumptions, questioning some commonly held perspectives, a very useful exercise for all of us. We appreciate you sharing your time with us today. And I do want to invite the audience to please join us next Monday for a discussion about the Biden administration, New START, and where we go on nuclear arms control with Russia. Thanks again, Dr. Stoner, and thanks to our participants for being with us. Everybody be well, be safe. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much.